One of the lessons from my fire hose of information at you here over the next 40 minutes will be that unfortunately a lot of the community detection tools that exist inside of R are pretty substandard, and that's maybe, you know, because my mom taught me not to say mean things if... So what I'd like to try to do is give you enough pointers to different information so that you can go find how to do some of these things. And that's not to say that you won't ever use R. Maybe you will, and I'll show you at least one out on the way out of things that you can try to do, since you will be using R for some things later on this afternoon. But most of the take-home message from this talk is to just be a little wary while you're doing it. Be aware that there are a lot of other options out there in other packages and other pieces of software. So I'm going to try to kind of get, let's see, is this actually, well, it doesn't matter. We won't point. So, you know, what do I mean when I say community detection, and why might it be useful? Some different ways that you could calculate some communities with some links to some different software. Again, largely avoiding what gets done in R, because you'll learn a little bit more about that later. Why do I say that the packages in R are a little substandard will be because of a rant that I will go on about the importance of what are called resolution parameters. And then the third part of the talk is this is the spot where Ashton Verdery said that he went back and, you know, figured out that he had 3 talks worth of slides and had fixed it, and I didn't. So that's all the extra stuff that there's absolutely no way we're going to get into unless Jim cedes all of his time to me, which he's not going to do. But there are some slides there with some helpful references that maybe will be useful to you in case you find yourself interested in multi-layer networks somewhere along the way. Jim said very kind things. I'm by no means the only person who spends a lot of my time obsessed with these kinds of topics. I've been really blessed with a lot of great collaborators, Jim among them, who worked on some of the papers that we're at least pointing to or alluding to in different spots of this talk, either when they were faculty, postdocs, grad students, or undergrads. There's a lot of undergrads have worked in my group, including some of the things that I'll talk about today. And the colors are sort of obvious if you recognize that I'm from UNC Chapel Hill and that I used to be at Georgia Tech, and I come hang out at Duke every once in a while. So, okay, so here's the philosophical disclaimer. Jim already told you, right? He basically takes any data set because it's just 2-mode data, and so he just turns it into a network and analyze it. And I kind of go one step even better or more obnoxious, which is that I will take that data set and turn it into a graph partitioning problem. And the reason for doing that for me is often because my experience has been that if you can get a handle on the high level grouping of your objects, your nodes in your data set, often that tells you a lot about what are the fundamental processes or the fundamental function going on underneath. So here's a little image that I like to steal from Aaron Clausette. You know, if I just have a hairball here, well, that maybe doesn't tell me a whole lot, but if I can do clustering or community detection of the nodes in this hairball into 3 groups, now I can start to query, you know, what are those 3 groups? If I can break those up into even smaller substructures, smaller communities, I can start querying what are the objects inside that data set and see if that helps me make hypotheses, tell a story, run different regressions, etc. So, but the underlying picture here is how do I do this in the first place? And no, well, this used to be true, and now I'm almost just putting this slide on here to be obnoxious. It used to be true that you could not give a community detection and networks talk without talking about the Karate Club. We have a lot of sociologists in the room, so who doesn't know about the Zachary Karate Club? Okay, a few people don't know about this. That's the health people in the room. Okay, so with apologies that the sociologists are going to all tell me that I got this story wrong. Basically, Zachary studied this university karate club and created this now very famous and overused for the purposes of community detection data set, where the links here were 2 people who are in the club are friends with each other. And getting some of the details wrong, but sort of the overarching gist of why this is an interesting community detection story. Basically, they ended up having, the members of this club ended up having a fight. Not the usual fight that they have every single day at the club, right, when they're actually supposed to be fighting, since it is a karate club, but they had a fundamental disagreement about the future of the club and the direction of the club. Basically, the president and one of the lead instructors got into a big argument about where they were going, and so it broke up into two rival karate clubs. And if you think a little bit about, what would you do? I mean, if I think about what I would do in that situation, for one thing, there's no karate if I'm in there in the first place. But what would I do if I'm in a club and suddenly there's this fight? Well, if I really, what'd you say, Jim? Have a dog in the fight or a horse in the race, depending on which part of the country you're in. So if you really have a dog in the fight here, you really are fundamentally vested in what the disagreement is, then that might impact which of the two clubs you go to. But if you're just there because it's something that you do for fun and you have a lot of friends in the club, which club are you going to go to? You're going to go to the club that has all your friends in it, or at least most of your friends in it. And so what ended up happening here is every one of the nodes in this force-directed layout is one of 34 members of this club who are in the largest connected component. And are they filled in dark or open is which one of the two rival clubs did they end up in after the disagreement. And again, the edges are that people are friends with each other outside the club. And so you can see that if you were to try to split this just by eye, whether you're trying to minimize the number of cuts that you have to take, this particular split is by something called modularity that I'll spend way too much time talking about today, so I'll tell you about it. But essentially, it really does kind of break naturally into two parts. So much so it breaks naturally that one of my colleagues, Mason Porter, who I do a lot of this work with, one of his students made a 3D printed model of the karate club for him. So instead of being force-directed layout in 2D, it was a force-directed layout in 3D, and actually 3D printed a force-directed layout of dots and edges connecting it, and then tried to mail it to him, and it broke in two during the mailing. It didn't quite break at the right spot. There's always one or two nodes that don't quite end up in where you want them to be, but it naturally splits into two communities. And so much so that when we had out at SAMC is the Statistical and Applied Mathematical Sciences Institute here in the Triangle. It's shared between the three research universities. We had a whole program year in complex networks nearly a decade ago, and Eric Kalachik was the lead organizer of this, so his name shows up on your reading, right? He got so sick of seeing us all talk about this that he said, if your method doesn't work on this network, go home. Because basically, any way that you might try to cluster this data is going to give you almost the same split into two groups. And that split into the two groups is a very good match to what actually happened in reality. Going this way. All right, so we're so obsessed with this that there's even a karate club. So if you're the first person at a network science conference to use the karate club as one of your data sets that you're doing an example on in your talk, then there's this little trophy here that has traveled the world and gets handed from one person to another, and I'm still bitter why I don't have this, but that's a whole side story. Let's talk about a different one, Facebook. Facebook's already sort of come up in many ways here as has some interesting ethical issues involved with it, and there's a whole hour talk I could probably just give about the stories of how we ended up with Facebook data and what kind of data we had and why it had all sorts of things in it we didn't know that it had in it, but I'll save that for another day. What I'll simply say about community detection in this is, so here's, the hairball here is the 700 plus students who at whatever this particular date in the fall of 2005 had Facebook accounts, and of course, so each node is a person or their Facebook page, and the edge between them is that they have reciprocal Facebook relationships. Basically, we were just handed this data by the chief technology officer. Why? Again, I could talk about this for like an hour, but this is maybe not a terribly useful visualization of anything happening in here. This is obviously the very early days of Facebook, right? You needed to have a .edu address to even have a Facebook account at this time. I've given you at least a little clue of what the story will be by the colors and shapes of the nodes here. So it's not just your eyes fooling you. Some of them are triangles, some of them are squares, some of them are circles. They're indicating what house at Caltech. So Caltech is one of these schools where virtually everyone lives on campus, and they live in, at the time, one of 8 house residences. And so these are the houses of the different Facebook users as volunteered on their own Facebook pages. And if you sort of squint at that, long enough, you go, well, okay, maybe most of the green is down here. A lot of the blue circles are up there. The red triangles are down here. It's almost a Lucky Charms commercial. But if you say, well, if I try to cluster the nodes here, what happens? And so we're going to take that visualization. We're going to run one of the community detection routines through it. We're just going to get one partition of nodes into groups. So this is what's called a hard partition. I'll say a little bit more about this in a little while. Essentially what we've done is every single one of these users has been assigned a community label. And we've taken everybody who has the same community label and grouped them together in one of these pie charts. So this community is pretty boring. It's just a small community. The communities are sized by the total, the area is proportional to the total number of people in it. This is just sort of a boring group that are all from this blue house. But you can see some of the larger communities have a very standard pattern to them. This one, for instance, is more than 3/4 of the users here are affiliated with the house that's colored in yellow. Nearly 3/4 of them here are the dark blue. This one's an interesting story. It's kind of a mix and match. These two houses are right next door to each other on one side of campus. No, we weren't supposed to know that. How we figured that out is part of the ethics rant. So it makes sense that there's a lot of relationships between these two. And effectively what we're measuring here is we're identifying that people have a larger density of ties within these communities than they have across the communities. So a lot of this makes sense, that there's a lot of grouping by houses, since so much of the social life at Caltech is organized around these. The one outlier color here, though, it's maybe hard to tell from where you are with the lighting, but there's a purple wedge here, there's a purple wedge here, there's a purple wedge here, purple, 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 purple. Anybody want to take a guess what purple might be in a data set like this? So I've got a bunch, well, you know the answer, John. I have a bunch of just self-reported data on their Facebook pages of where they live, except for the purple, which are the ones who didn't say where they live. But if I were a betting man, and I'm running some sort of event for this yellow house, I'm probably sending an invite to everyone in that purple wedge. Worse, we actually were mistakenly given the true UIDs of all of these users. So we could have looked up how accurate this would be as imputing the missing data. We never did, I promise, and long ago flushed that data. But it's pretty clear to me by the densities of these other, the fraction of the nodes that we do have labels on, that probably with a pretty high degree of certainty you could predict where these people live, even if they didn't volunteer the information, which to me is always a little scary. But here, this was 2005. We did a lot of this work nearly a decade ago. People seem to get all exercised about what the latest Facebook thing is, and then it goes away, and then they'll get exercised about what the next Facebook thing is a year from now, and it'll go away. And so there you go. That's now something I've gone and said on tape. That was probably stupid, but there you go. Okay, so now these are, why would you want to do this is maybe not something I've convinced you of yet, other than I can stand up here and say, tell snarky stories about Facebook data. We'll say a few more things about reasons why you might want to do this, but sort of from this point here of the talk, I have to really stress that I am scratching only the very topsoil of the surface here on a very, very deep mine of different activity that's going on in community detection. We had a couple comments earlier about block modeling. Stochastic block models are a big piece of community detection that I really won't say a whole lot, but there's a couple slides about stochastic block models and multi-layer networks later. Really to just sort of hammer home how much activity there is. There are these two old reviews. I was involved in writing one of them nearly a decade ago. Santo Fortunato wrote just an absolute tome of a review. For those who are close enough, this is a page 75 to page 174 of physics reports, which is one of those like really dense small print review journals. And so, I mean, that's just an unbelievable tome of information about what the state of community detection was in 2010. He's since written an updated user guide in physics reports a couple years ago. We have maybe if you're new to this and you're trying to decide, do I want to do something in community detection? Sarai Shea and my group led a group of us to write what we call the little case studies paper. Jim, is this ever going to get published? Okay, this is supposed to be in a handbook that Jim's supposed to edit, but in the meantime, you can find it on the art. I'm sorry?
It is editing it, it's just slow.
Okay, so in the meantime, you can read it. It's on the archive preprint server. It's really laid out as just a set of case studies, not focused so much on the methods that got used, but on the why. Why was doing community detection interesting? And I promise that unlike the talk in the case studies article, they aren't all ours. So in my self-absorbed talk, though, many of them are ours. One of the ways in which communities are often found is what's called modularity. I sort of mentioned this very briefly, but what do we really mean by modularity? Modularity has a wonderful phrase that then you have to mathematize. So a good partition of nodes into communities, sticking labels on them, has more total intra-community edge weight than one would expect at random. It's a nice phrase, than one would expect at random, except for that I'm the mathematician, so I have to say, well, in what model would we actually do this? And so the way that this gets set up, and this is really all driven by Mark Newman and Michel Gervan, now going on nearly 15 years ago, is there's going to be some quality to the partition. So the function Q is something that we're measuring. It's a function of the network that you have and the labels that you're trying out. And what we're going to do is then we're going to pick the labels that maximize this quality Q. Since it's an optimization problem, the prefactor doesn't really matter, but it's usually the total edge weight. Here's sort of the tricky part. It's just a big sum. It's a sum over all pairs of nodes ij, but here's this little indicator function. So this function is just 1 if the labels, the community label of CI and the community label of CJ are the same. So you count it if they're both in the same community, and you don't count it otherwise. So now what do you count? Well, you're only counting this thing Bij, which is called the modularity matrix. I've never really understood why it got the symbol B. I always just sort of assumed Mark gave it B because it came after A, since A is almost always our adjacency matrix. And so B is just the data you have minus what you expect at random. So it really is exactly the quantification here of we're summing up all pairs of nodes that are in the same community, and we're counting the total edge weight between them minus what we would expect at random. Now, what do you expect at random? Well, in the simple, and there's lots of details here about how actually doing this is computationally complex. There's lots of great packages. Some of them exist in R, but there will be some problems I'll get to. And, but basically, the real take home here is you got to pick what do you mean by at random. This is maybe eating a little bit into some things that you'll say tomorrow. I don't know if you're going to bring some of these things up. But you might say that the simplest thing you would say is that you have an Erdos-Renyi random graph and that every edge is there independently with some probability p. And if you assumed this, then there are lots of consequences of that fact. In particular, your degree distribution now is going to be a Poisson distribution. But that turns out to be not a terribly good distribution relative to a lot of real-world data. So if I take the Poisson distribution with the density of this Caltech data I was talking about, I basically just get something that looks like a little bit of a bell curve. You can't see any of the labels here. The truth is I can't see any of the labels here. But it has the right mean degree and not a whole lot else. Whereas the true degree distribution of that Caltech data that I showed you here drops off with a much heavier tail. The numbers down here are degrees of 100, 150. Some of them have degree 200. Remembering this is a data set with only like 700 some users in it. The mean degree here is somewhere around 35 or 40, and it's very tightly distributed. So that bell curve is like sitting here. And it's not at all like the real data. So simply saying it's an Erdos-Renyi random graph might be a really bad thing to compare against. And Mark Newman's done some really nice work showing that if you assume that, what this modularity function might really be getting you amounts to core periphery structure if you're interested in that. So what Mark and Michelle did instead was they said, well, let's just take the simplest model will be that we'll put down independent edges, but we'll constrain them that the expected degree sequence we're going to get is the actual observed degree sequence. So there will be, this is like a configuration model or a Chung-Lu model, things that maybe Jim will mention tomorrow. If he doesn't, that's okay. Basically, it gives you a formula for what this Pij weight is that you're going to subtract. The default is that this little prefactor is gamma is just equal to 1, and so ki is the degree of node ki, or if it's a weighted graph, the strength of ki. Again, w is the total weight of all the edges. And basically, this is the factor that gets subtracted off in the modularity matrix. We'll come back and tell you about gamma being not 1 in a little while, because it turns out to be important. If you want to go do sort of what are the high-level stories here for you, getting out of the weeds for a second. If you want to go do community detection on your data, you have to respect what kind of data you have. If it's weighted or unweighted, it turns out that for most modularity-based community detection, that's not a problem, although if it's weighted data, you're going to have a lot of trouble fitting the correct stochastic block model to it. If you have bipartite data, then that might be something that you want to respect. If you actually want to keep both modes and do community detection on both modes, if you have red nodes and blue nodes and there are no edges red to red or blue to blue, then your model has to respect that. And Barber did some work where you put in zeros explicitly in the spots where your bipartite structure says it should be 0. If it's directed, you have a slightly different model than if it's undirected. You have to keep track of the in degree and the out degree. My point is simply here on this slide to say you've got to respect the kind of graph that you're looking at. Very similar to some of the things that came up in the labs so far about whether you're directed or undirected. Okay, so now I mentioned this is computationally complex. I put this slide on here just to say that this is one of the many computational heuristics that seem to do a really good job on this. It's a beautiful little idea. It's called the Louvain method. If my accent was better, then then you'd call it something slightly different. But Blondel and his collaborators came up with this. I love this paper. It's very readable. It has 2 good ideas in it. My old postdoc advisor used to say that your paper really only needs to have 1 good idea in it because that's 1 more than most of the literature. But this one has 2 really good ideas in it. One of them is it's almost laughable how simple of an idea it is. But basically, they were the first ones to write down in the literature a simple formula for how, rather than counting this Q quality measure, rather than just calculating it from scratch for every partition, that if you took a partition you had and you just pulled one of the nodes out of a community into a community unto itself, how big of a change is that in the queue? And the symbols here are unimportant for the purposes right now, but just to say that what is the bookkeeping that you have to do in order to make that calculation really fast? Because if you can take a node out of the community that it's in and hold it by itself, and then take it from holding it by itself and putting it in a different community, you can test lots of things really, really fast that people had been just brute forcing up until that point. The second good idea is that they do this in stages. So they move one node around at a time. And so they start with so here's just a little example. This is a figure stolen gratuitously from their paper, but I at least cited it. So here's where they start. And so they've got, they're moving around nodes one at a time. And after sort of moving them around one at a time, they seem to have found 4 communities. Found in the sense that they can't get any bigger increases in Q by just moving one node at a time. And so then what they do is they take this graph of 4 different communities and they aggregate it down onto a network of just 4 nodes. So each community now just becomes a single node with self loops corresponding to the number of within community edges that were already present in the full graph. And they do this, they realized that the way modularity is set up, you can do this bookkeeping so that the modularity of this thing is exactly the same as the modularity of the original data, and that any labels you push around on here are equivalent to the modularity on the big data. And so now they can push around these nodes one at a time, remembering that every one of these nodes corresponds to multiple nodes in the original graph. but they can move those around one at a time until they can't do any better. And they just keep building up through these passes until they're done. There's no guarantee that this will work. In fact, right, it's a well-known NP-complete problem to correctly optimize modularity, but this heuristic in practice works really, really well. And so it's in R, it's in Python, it's in lots of different things. Okay, so that's telling you a little bit about what it is. Now, why would you want to know these communities other than to try to win this little karate club trophy or to get yourself in trouble by saying things about Facebook? Well, here's a great example that YYON and some of his collaborators did a few years ago. In short, what they, you can look at the details of this paper if you're interested. I think it's a great paper. What they did is they studied the propagation of a variety of different memes on Twitter. And one of the many things that they did in this paper was they tried to build a classifier that could take early data. Now, what's a meme? I mean, a meme in this case is a hashtag, and then tweets with that hashtag and retweets of those tweets. And they tried to build a classifier that would try to use early stage information about the presence of a meme to predict whether or not it would go viral. It would go through some, exponential-like growth that then spread out to a large fraction of the Twitter network. In short, it turned out that they did a lot better if they looked at community detection of the users and their followers and whether or not memes, so here's one picture is the early stage data was a meme that was largely within a single community. And it never really took hold outside of that community of Twitter users. Whereas a different meme that started off spreading multiple communities exploded at the later stage. And so whether the extent to which a meme is constrained within a community or not is one of the inputs to their classifier. And this is basically just showing the precision and recall of some different classifiers that they did. The dark bars that are higher than everything else are the ones where they included community information. Another reason you would want to do it that might be really relevant to this group. So this is not a real diffusion of a real infection, but it's models of a simulated infection. And so here we were looking at different theoretical models that took into account degree distributions and degree-degree correlations for predicting the spread of, in this case, a complex contagion, a Watts threshold model, on some of that same kind of Facebook data that we had before, but Facebook data that's going across multiple universities, and so it has a very deep community structure. The long and short of this story here is the red curve is if you try to build an analytical model that knows nothing about the communities, but knows a lot about the joint degree-degree distribution, which is for many problems what you need to be very accurate. In many other settings, if you have the degree-degree distribution, you do a really good job on your analytical model predicting what happens on average of the spread of a contagion like this. But if you don't have the community information in something that has deep communities, surprise, you do a bad job. If you include only the community information, which is the dashed line, but you give up all the information about the degree distribution and the joint degree-degree distribution, you do a remarkable job matching the numerical data. And of course, you do best if you use both these things. But then you end up with unwieldy models called PI, I prime, KK prime. And it's a little crazy, and the math is very long, but it does a pretty good job getting your simulated spread of how quickly a contagion spreads over time. So this is an example of why you need communities for things like this. All right, with 15 minutes to go. All right, other things we're not going to tell you about this. All right, because it's basically resolution parameters are important, but let me tell you a few other examples of where communities are important, and then we'll tell you, believe it or not, some things about some code. Jim said you can turn anything into a network. So here's an example of turning anything into a network. What we've done here is we're showing you an adjacency matrix of a bunch of United States senators who are connected to each other because they vote yay or nay on different bills in a 2-year congressional period. The strong yellows are people who voted in the same way nearly 100% of the time. The deepest blue is people who never voted the same way. The diagonal, so the self loop of you're always identical to yourself, has just been removed from the data. Again, kind of keeping track of that, you often end up with different kinds of data if you simply take objects and features, or in this case, senators and votes, and you map it into a unipartite network of senators connected to senators because how frequently they vote. This is a very dense adjacency matrix relative to other networks. This just happens to be some congressional committee assignment pictures, which are much sparser, right? If you have the actual relationships between people tend to be much sparser than something that you get when you do this. Of course, there's only 100 senators at a time, so you don't really mind that you end up with a dense matrix here. If you want to have very large data sets where you look at things like this, then you have to decide how to threshold things. You might be curious, okay, what does this look like compared to what happens normally? This is more like what things look like in our modern politics. This is the 85th Senate. Nothing major happened here. This is just the first of the major civil rights era legislation. So it's kind of a contentious period, but they got along a lot better than they do in the 21st century. I can't believe I say all these things on tape because, but there it is. All credit for the beauty of this visualization that I will not talk about at length goes to Jim. I just handed him some data and he said, well, what if you take these data sets and ask about how much do these things vary over time? So I showed you something that was the 85th Senate. This picture here goes from 1975 through to 2012. So the 85th Senate is over there somewhere. But you can, what's being plotted here is the spread between the two major groups is basically how partisan is the environment, how far apart are they in this modularity sense. And so you can see the increase in polarization as they get spread further and further apart at the same time that there's a hollowing out of the middle. And I'll point you to the paper that I just did some data and Jim did all the real work on to learn more about how something cool like that could be done if you have some temporal data. All right, and then one more example before I say a few things about code. Here's another example where you take objects and features and you turn them into a network. Here the objects are clinical isolates from UTI presenting patients in a clinic in St. Louis, Missouri. So there's 337 different cultured specimens of the E. coli bacteria that caused UTI. And the edges between them are how similar are they from comparing well-known genetic virulence factors between them. And so the communities here, I mean, you can do a force-directed layout and kind of already see just from the force-directed layout that it looks like it clusters into some big groups. There's definitely a big group down here, a big group up here, some very similar looking things up here. This is a partition into 4 communities that was found just by brute forcing this through. It turns out that this is important because the communities are very closely associated with just a small handful. 3 of the genetic features in these uropathogenic E. coli seem to be largely responsible for this layout and for the community assignments. And if you knew where a new infection that presented in clinic, if you were able to classify where in this diagram that infection was closest to, that would tell you a lot, at least probabilistically, about how likely it is that that infection is going to be resistant to either of the 2 major antibiotics for treating UTIs. Unfortunately, the downside of this in its current state is that in order to get that data, you have to go culture the infection, send it off for effectively a whole genome sequencing, sit around and wait a couple days, few days, to get this information. And guess what you need to do as soon as the patient shows up in your clinic? You need to prescribe them an antibiotic. So, this is, we're working on ways to get this done more quickly. But here there's an example where seeing just this high-level structure, the high-level clustering of these nodes into these groups tells you a lot about the differences between them that you can expect. If it's in group 1, it's very highly likely to be resistant to Cipro versus group 2, very highly likely to be susceptible to Cipro. And that could be a really important information clinically. All right, so I spent almost all my time doing point 1. I promised I would never do point 3. Let's point you to some things in point 2 where you can hopefully be dangerous if you think that this is a useful thing to look at. So, of course, most of this week, all this week, we're in R. There are community detection codes in R. I ask that you use them, in particular in RI graph, I ask that you use them all with a salt lick-sized grain of salt, that they work really well, but they're all tuned to one scale. And they will only tell you about your clusters in your network at a single scale, which can be really problematic. Just since you have the slides, and again, I'm barely scratching the surface of things that you can do with codes that are out there. Mapequation.org has some really, really great codes for clustering nodes. InfoMap that's on the MapEquation page basically it's all based on minimum description lengths and how do you make these assignments in a way to minimize what's called the description length. Graph tool, Tiago Peixoto's graph tool runs in Python. It's a really phenomenal code for doing stochastic block models of hard partitions, of overlapping communities, lots of different things. If you want to run this Louvain algorithm in Python, Vincent Trog has a really great usable code. It's all built on the iGraph that's in Python, which is unfortunately not equivalent to the iGraph that is built in R. So the kinds of things that Vincent has in this code in Python have not been ported over to R. If you're really brave or a mathematician like me and you want to open up MATLAB, or you need to do multi-layer community detection, which we'll say one thing about before we finish, we have a Gen Louvain package that you can get off of one of my web pages. So why am I bashing the R community detection codes? I'm bashing them because there's no resolution parameter. So if I pull out the resolution parameter out of the model and I make it explicit, right, what are we doing? We're optimizing this quality, only counting places where the indicator is 1 so that we're only counting over pairs of nodes that are in the same community. We're taking the data we have minus what we would expect at random. But the gamma factor is very important out here because the gamma factor is like the knob on an old school analog radio. Or as Chris Danforth likes to say, every good microscope needs to have at least one knob. And the knob here allows you to tune, do you want a very small number of large communities or do you want many smaller communities? And I like to think of it really as like a knob on the radio that I'm going to tune and let the data tell me what's the right scale of doing this. And so here's an example of some data from some foreign exchange market data. There's a lot going on this plot. All I really want you to do is pay attention to the purple line. So what we're showing here in the purple line is the number of communities that were found, unfortunately normalized to the total number of nodes in the graph. The number of communities that were found at each value of gamma as we tuned the knob. And one of the things you can see over here is that the spot near 1 is right near a step that effectively is just taking you from what I think is only 2 or 3 communities to 3 or 4 communities. I mean, it's right near the step. It's like right on the edge between 2 different kinds of solutions. So if you were really interested in this big plateau here, probably you'd do better to pick it out at a value of gamma that's below 1. Here's a plateau that runs from a range of gamma that's somewhere like 1.35 up to 1.6, where we find almost the same. This black line tells me it's actually 2 different partitions, but that's not important to this right now. We find almost the same community structure over a wide range of tuning the knob. And unfortunately, R doesn't give you access to this knob, right? R, you're just stuck at 1. It'd be like, you're stuck at 980 AM and, whatever radio station that is or whatever static that is, that's what you're going to get stuck with. So sometimes it's useful, but, be a wary user. And I should say that these resolution parameters are a bit of a, I mean, it's almost more of an art than a science. There's a lot of active work. We wrote a paper about how to take all this information after you tune the knob and you go look at things at a different range of them. And there's some code on GitHub for the algorithm that we developed that was published last year. Just last month, right, if you've ever looked at the archive preprint server, you know to read these things as year, month, article number. So this is from last month. A new paper about how to connect these resolution parameters in different settings. All right, so what kinds of things happen when you do these? Just a couple other little slideshows of why it could be important to use this resolution parameter. Here's an old college football network. So this is what we used to call Division 1A college football. Now it's called the Football Bowl subdivision. So this is the 2000 season. So this is the 115 college football teams, Div 1A college football teams, and they're connected to each other if they played each other in that season. And if you know anything about college sports or college football, you know that there's a very deep, rigid conference and division structure that overlays the rules of who they're going to play. ACC teams play like 7 of their games against other ACC teams in a season that only lasts, say, 11, 12, or 13 games. So you expect a very strong community structure here. The force-directed layout, the colors are a particular partition that seems to be well connected to the communities. But if you try to now tune the knob, and every one of the yellow dots is a result that comes out of Louvain, well, okay, there's a lot of static, there's a lot of increase in the number of communities, then something kind of flattens out, but it's still a little staticky, and then it increases. And the thing we're trying to do in this so-called CHAMP package that I referenced on the previous page is we're finding a way to, the details in there maybe aren't important, and we're finding a way, now look at the solid line, to pick out what are the true optimizers at the different values of gamma, remembering that these are all heuristics, right? This is a computationally complex problem. It's NP complete. So the solution that actually solves this problem from the set of solutions that we have is a 12 community partition that lives over this very large range of gamma. But I caution you again that it's actually at a gamma bigger than 1. So there are tools. There's a lot more slides in here to say, to give you pointers to different ways to do this. There are different tools that help you post-process your partitions if you have access to a resolution parameter. If all you want is a quick and dirty community label to overlay with a visualization and then to just kind of see, does it smell like it looks right? That's fine. Use R. I'm happy for that. But if you want to get really deep into the weeds of whether or not the communities that you're finding are important, if you're trying to use this to make a clinical decision, like which antibiotic is going to be administered to somebody, then you really have to get yourself out of R to one of these other packages. I think the next couple things are just more of the same. I guess here's the one last trick if you are in R. So if you find yourself in this middle range, and you don't know which of those two classifications that I just laid out to put yourself in. Like, I really don't want to go to something other than R. It's been painful enough, right? Now you're telling me I have to go learn how to do this in Python, or I have to go learn how to do this in MATLAB. There's one hack that's almost like the same resolution parameter that you can try. And what you can do, it's in this great paper by Alex Arenas and some of his collaborators, and we talk about it in the case studies paper if you just want to find it there. So rather than this gamma hack, what they do instead is they add self loops to every node in the graph. And if you make the self loops strong enough, so now it has to be a weighted network. If you make the self loops strong enough, it has the same effect in a qualitative way of forcing you to have a larger number of smaller communities. And so you can make this same kind of plot of here's the number of communities that you found versus a knob. Here the knob is how strong are these self loops that I've added into my network. And if you do that and you see sort of big plateaus, then that might be the decision for you of, are you happy with the answer you already have, or you need to go do something else? And this will run perfectly fine using the packages that are in R. You just have to make sure that you include the weights in the correct way. So that's really all I got to tell you about. If you want to know what a multi-layer network is, you can look at the rest of the slides. You can decide if that's important to you. Otherwise, thank you for your time.
Do you deal with a case where the same person can be in multiple communities, or are these mutually exclusive?
So a lot of the pictures that I showed you are hard partitions where no. But for instance, if you go look at this is a little better worked out, particularly in the case of block modeling. So if you look at Tiago Peixoto's graph tool, he has a whole bunch of overlapping communities. And then there's also some things in the literature. There are some tricks where instead of partitioning nodes, you partition edges. You decide which edges are in which communities of edges, and then that gives you a frequency labeling for each node of which communities it's in. So yes and no. Sometimes we only do just the hard partitioning of the nodes, but there are some tools to look at overlapping communities.
How does the litigation of R, if you employ that tactic, saying that adding self-loops, and then you go to calculate the quality function Q, isn't that going to throw it off because there's a bunch of self-loops on each node?
Well, so that's a great question. It's what you're measuring at that point is the Q at that value of the self-loop R. From the standpoint of what you're doing is you're optimizing for that fixed value of R, and the only real purpose of Q here is as the objective function that's being optimized for, then it doesn't matter. Please do not find yourself, maybe this is, I'm going to take your question, I'm going to twist it, into please do not find yourself in the situation where you're arguing in a serious way that a particular value of modularity, 0.4, 0.6, means that your communities are strong or weak. Because the distribution of them under some random graph model can depend on the density, on the size, on the number of nodes, the number of edges, lots of other features. So the fact that the Q is now different with those R's in it is okay, because you're still just finding the biggest value of Q for that fixed R. And then don't compare that Q to the Q you have over here when R was 0. Great question.